Mercer Concert Hall in Midtown Chicago had not been this full since the night its founder died. 300 seats of hand-stitched burgundy velvet faced a stage lit by a single overhead beam that fell in a perfect circle onto the 9-foot Steinway Model D at its center. The piano was ebony, its lid raised like a wing, its keys exposed under the light like a row of teeth bared in a smile that no longer meant anything kind. It had not been played in public for 11 years. Tonight, in front of every donor, critic, and city official who still cared whether the Mercer lived or closed, it was supposed to sing again. Celeste Moreau stood at the edge of the stage in a navy sheath dress with her dark hair pinned tight against her skull. She was 36, the youngest executive director the Mercer had ever appointed, and the only one who had inherited the position not from merit alone but from grief. Her mother, Renata Moreau, had built the Mercer from a condemned Baptist church into one of the finest chamber music venues in the Midwest. Renata had died of pancreatic cancer 14 months ago, and the board had offered Celeste the title the way one offers a life jacket to someone already underwater. She had accepted because refusing felt like a second funeral. The Steinway was Renata's. She had purchased it in 1987 from a retiring concert pianist in Montreal, and had it shipped across the border in a climate-controlled truck she drove herself. It was the instrument on which every major performance at the Mercer had been open for 23 years, until the night Renata's hands became too weak to reach the keys and she asked for the lid to be closed. No one had opened it since. Tonight was the Mercer's 60th anniversary gala, and the centerpiece was a promise Celeste had made to the donors 6 months ago. The Steinway would be restored, retuned, and played live by the evening's guest soloist. The promise had seemed manageable in January. By March, the first tuner had quit, citing irreparable soundboard damage. By April, the second had recommended the piano be retired to a museum. By May, a third specialist from New York had spent 2 weeks inside the instrument and declared it structurally sound, but acoustically dead. He could not explain why. The hammers struck. The strings vibrated. But the sound that came out was flat and thin, as though the piano were speaking through a closed mouth. Now, Celeste stood backstage holding a wireless microphone and listening to her stage manager confirm what she already knew. The soloist had tested the Steinway 30 minutes ago and refused to perform. He was in a taxi heading back to his hotel. 300 people were taking their seats. Douglas Fenn, the 61-year-old chairman of the board who had spent the past year suggesting in every meeting that the Mercer would be better served by a more experienced director, was sitting in the third row with his reading glasses already on, prepared to watch her fail with the patience of a man who had been waiting for exactly this. In the loading corridor behind the stage, a tall man in a gray work shirt was kneeling on the concrete floor, helping a small girl zip her jacket. Jonah Hartwell was 41 years old. His hands were wide and rough at the knuckles, and his fingertips carried the particular smoothness of a man who had spent 20 years running them across piano wire. He had been hired 2 days ago through a temp staffing agency to help move furniture and music stands for the gala setup. The listing had paid $160 for 2 days of labor. He had taken the job because his daughter, Rosie, was 7 years old, and she had never been inside a real concert hall. Rosie Hartwell held a small brass tuning fork against her chest the way another child might hold a stuffed animal. It had belonged to her mother. Claire Hartwell had been a piano teacher at a community center in Rockford, Illinois, and she had carried that tuning fork in her coat pocket every day of her adult life. She used to tap it against the kitchen counter on Sunday mornings and hold it up to Rosie's ear. "Hear that?" she would say. "That's the note the whole world tunes to." Claire had died in a car accident on a February evening when Rosie was 4. She had been driving home from a recital. The roads were icy, and the other driver never saw the stop sign. After Claire's death, Jonah closed the small piano restoration shop he had run out of their garage and took whatever work kept him within driving distance of Rosie's school. He tuned pianos at churches and community centers. He moved equipment for events. He repaired older prides that no one else wanted to touch. The money was uneven, but he could pick Rosie up at 3:15 every afternoon, help her with her homework at the kitchen table, and sit on the edge of her bed every night until her breathing slowed and her fingers finally loosened their grip on the brass tuning fork. He had not expected to hear a Steinway Model D tonight. He had certainly not expected to hear one dying. But 30 minutes ago, while carrying a stack of folding chairs past the stage door, Jonah had stopped. The soloist was running through the opening bars of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 inside the hall. Jonah set the chairs down and listened, not to the melody but to the architecture beneath it. The treble register was clear. The mid-range was acceptable. But somewhere in the bass, between C2 and F2, there was a sound that should not have been there. Not a buzz, not a rattle, something softer, a dampening, as though a hand were pressing gently against the soundboard from the inside, muffling the resonance before it could bloom. He had tilted his head and spoken quietly, more to himself than to anyone in the corridor. That isn't a broken piano. Something is holding it back. A stagehand nearby had heard him. The stagehand told the stage manager. The stage manager, desperate, told Celeste. Now Celeste Moreau stood at the edge of the loading corridor and looked at the man kneeling on the concrete with his daughter. She saw the work shirt. She saw the scuffed boots. She saw the staffing agency lanyard click to his belt. And because she was standing under the weight of 300 expectations and a soloist who had already left, she did not hear what he had said. She heard only that a furniture mover was offering opinions about a piano that 3 certified technicians had failed to fix. She walked toward him. Her heels clicked on the concrete with the measured rhythm of someone who has learned to make every step sound deliberate. I'm told you think you know what's wrong with my piano. Jonah stood slowly. Rosie moved behind his leg, one hand still clutching the tuning fork. I didn't say I know what's wrong with it, Jonah said. I said something is holding it back. There's a difference. Celeste studied him for a moment. The microphone in her hand was still live. Beyond the stage door, the murmur of the audience was growing louder, the particular restless hum of an expensive crowd waiting for a program that was already 5 minutes late. 3 specialists have examined that instrument, she said. One of them is on the faculty at Juilliard. Are you on the faculty at Juilliard? A lighting tech near the door smiled. A stagehand looked at the floor. Jonah did not answer immediately. He glanced down at Rosie, whose eyes had gone wide and still, the way a child's eyes go when she recognizes the shape of an adult being unkind to her father. No, ma'am, he said. I'm not on the faculty anywhere. Celeste should have stopped there. In a calmer moment, she might have, but Douglas Fenn was in the 3rd row and the soloist was gone, and the donors were checking their watches, and the sound of her mother's piano sitting silent on that stage was louder in her chest than any voice in the corridor. So she did what frightened people do when they cannot afford to look frightened. She turned the fear outward. Then maybe, she said, letting her voice carry just enough for the nearby crew to hear. You should stick to carrying chairs and leave the instrument to the professionals. The corridor went quiet. The lighting tech stopped smiling. Rosie's grip on the tuning fork tightened until the veins on the back of her small hand stood out. Jonah placed his palm on the top of Rosie's head. He did not look at the crew. He did not look at Celeste. Come on, sweetheart, he said. Let's get your coat on. He took Rosie's hand and turned toward the exit. The corridor parted the way corridors part for people who have been told they do not belong. Not with hostility, but with the quiet relief of witnesses who are glad the discomfort is moving away from them. Celeste watched them walk. She saw the man's unhurried stride, the complete absence of anger in the way he moved. She saw the girl's face turn once over her shoulder, not looking at Celeste but at the stage door, beyond which the dark shape of the Steinway was barely visible under its single light. The child's expression was not hurt. It was longing. Something shifted in Celeste's chest. She did not name it. She pushed it away and walked back to the stage. 7 minutes passed. The audience was growing audibly restless. Douglas Fenn caught Celeste's eye from the 3rd row and offered a small, sympathetic shrug that was not sympathetic at all. Beside him, Lillian Tate, The 73-year-old patron, whose annual gift of $400,000 kept the Mercer's doors open, folded her program in half and set it on her lap, a gesture Celeste recognized as the beginning of departure. Celeste picked up her phone and called the soloist. Voicemail. She called the backup accompanist on the program. Not available. She called the tuning firm in New York. Office closed. She was about to step on stage and deliver the announcement that would end the gala and very probably her directorship, when the stage manager appeared at her elbow. He's still in the parking lot. The man with the kid. His truck won't start. Celeste closed her eyes. Why are you telling me this? Because I've worked here for 19 years, and I've never heard anyone listen to that piano the way he did. He wasn't guessing. He heard something specific. Celeste stood very still for a long time. Then she walked out the loading dock door and into the parking lot. Jonah was standing beside an old white Ford F-150 with the hood up. Rosie was sitting on the front bumper swinging her legs, the tuning fork resting on her knee. The truck's battery was dead, a flat, familiar irony. A man who could hear what was wrong with a piano from 30 feet away, stranded by a machine he could not start. Celeste stopped 10 feet from the truck. She had taken off her heels at some point and was standing on the asphalt in bare feet, under the parking lot light, without the stage behind her. She looked less like an executive and more like a woman who had run out of plans. "I need help," she said. Jonah looked at her over the open hood. He did not gloat. He did not remind her of what she had said. He only waited. The soloist left. "The piano is..." She paused. "The piano was my mother's. She bought it before I was born. I promised 300 people they would hear it tonight, and I cannot make that happen alone." Rosie looked up at her father. The tuning fork caught the parking lot light and flashed once. "Daddy," she said quietly. "That's the piano we heard." Jonah said nothing for a moment. He looked at his daughter's face, at the tuning fork in her hand, at the way she had turned her whole small body toward the building, as though it were pulling her back by some frequency only she could feel. Claire had told Rosie, on the last night before the accident, that her daddy could hear things inside a piano that nobody else could hear. She had said it while Jonah was kneeling beside a battered Yamaha upright that had been donated to the community center, and Rosie had been sitting cross-legged on the floor watching him work. He remembered Claire standing in the doorway with 2 mugs of tea, saying it the way she said everything, as though it were simply a fact of the natural world, like gravity or the color of the sky. If Jonah drove away tonight, he was not wrong. No reasonable person would blame him, but Rosie would learn that when someone speaks to you with contempt, the correct response is to leave even when you know something they do not. She would carry that lesson into every audition, every classroom, every moment when someone in authority told her she did not belong. He closed the hood of the truck. "I'll look at it," he said, "but I'm not performing for your donors. If I find the problem, I fix it. That's all. That's all I'm asking. And my daughter stays with me. She doesn't wait in a hallway. She doesn't get sent to a corner." Celeste looked at Rosie. The girl met her gaze with the unblinking appraisal of a 7-year-old who has not yet decided whether this person is safe. "She stays with you," Celeste said. They walked back into the building together. The stage manager met them at the loading dock with an expression that was equal parts disbelief and desperate hope. Celeste murmured something about buying time and stepped on stage to address the audience with a brief remarks about the evening's program being adjusted to honor the spirit of the Mercer's founding. It was vague enough to be true and confident enough to hold the room for another 10 minutes. Jonah walked onto the stage from the wings with Rosie's hand in his. The work lights were up. The Steinway sat in its circle of light like a patient animal waiting to be understood. Douglas Fenn, watching from the 3rd row, leaned toward the woman beside him and whispered something that made her cover her mouth. Jonah did not approach the keyboard. He walked to the side of the piano and placed both hands flat on the case, just above the curve of the rim. He stood there for several seconds with his head slightly bowed, not praying but listening, feeling for the vibration that lived inside the wood even when no key was struck. the resonance of a great instrument at rest. Rosie stood 3 feet away, holding her tuning fork, watching her father the way she always watched him when he worked, with total, unquestioning faith. A young technician in the wings leaned toward his colleague. "What's he doing, meditating?" Harlan Cage did not laugh. Harlan was 64, the Mercer's head piano technician, and the only person on staff who had worked with Renata Moreau during the years she still tuned the Steinway herself. He watched the stranger's hands on the case and recognized the posture immediately. He had seen Renata stand that way 100 times. It was not theater. It was the oldest form of diagnosis there was. "Play a chromatic scale in the bass register," Jonah said. Slowly, 1 note every 2 seconds. Harlan stepped forward without being asked. He sat at the bench and began. C1, C sharp, D. Each note rang out, filled the hall, and faded. Jonah's eyes were closed. His fingers did not move on the case. He was tracking the decay of each note, the way each one surrendered its energy to the air. Measuring not the sound itself, but the silence that followed. At E2, he opened his eyes. Again, E2, louder this time. Harlan struck the key. The note rose, bloomed, and then something happened. Not a cut, not a mute. A softening. The resonance folded inward on itself as though it had been caught by something and gently smothered. "There," Jonah said. He moved to the underside of the piano and lowered himself to the floor. He lay on his back beneath the instrument the way a mechanic lies beneath a car, and shone a small flashlight upward at the soundboard. For almost a full minute, he said nothing. He traced the grain of the spruce with his eyes, following the bridges, the ribs, the places where decades of climate and vibration had left their marks. Then his lights stopped moving. Who put a damping pad on the underside of the 4th bass bridge? The hall went quiet. Harlan rose from the bench and walked around to where Jonah lay. "Show me." Jonah angled the flashlight. There, barely visible against the spruce, a small rectangle of dense felt had been glued to the underside of the bridge. It was the same color as the wood. It had been placed so carefully that it was nearly invisible even under direct light. Harlan bent closer. His throat went tight. He knew what he was looking at. "Renata did that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She added it herself, years ago." Celeste, who had come back from the stage and was standing in the wings, heard him. She stepped forward. "My mother put that there? Why?" Harlan straightened slowly. In her last years, the lowest register had a resonance that bothered her. A particular overtone. She said it clashed with the way she heard the upper partials. No one else could hear it. She asked me to fix it, and I told her there was nothing wrong. So she fixed it herself. She glued a damper to the bridge to absorb the overtone she didn't like. He paused. "I'd forgotten. It was such a small thing. But it's been changing the voicing of the entire bass end for years. The new tuners couldn't find it because they were looking for a fault. It's not a fault. It's a choice." Jonah slid out from under the piano and stood. He looked at Celeste. "Your mother didn't break this instrument. She made it play the way she wanted it to play. But what she wanted isn't what a standard tuning expects. Every technician who's looked at this piano has been trying to fix something that was never broken. They've been correcting for her preference without knowing it was there." Celeste did not speak for a long time. She was looking at the small felt pad beneath the bridge the way a daughter looks at a handwritten note found in a coat pocket years after a funeral. "Can you fix it?" she asked. "I can remove the pad. But if I do, the piano won't sound the way your mother tuned it. It will sound the way Steinway built it. You'd be choosing the instrument over her." He paused. "Or I can revoice around the pad. Keep what she did and tune the rest of the piano to match. It won't be standard, but it will be hers." The choice hung in the air between them. Douglas Fenn, who had walked to the edge of the stage to see what was happening, inserted himself with the practiced smoothness of a man who understood that decisions made in public are harder to reverse. Ms. Moreau, we cannot allow an unvetted laborer to modify a piano worth $250,000 in front of our patrons. Whatever his theory, this needs to be reviewed by a certified Harlan, Celeste said without looking at Douglas. Is he right? Harlan Cage, who had 64 years of life and 40 of them spent inside pianos, looked at Jonah Hartwell the way one craftsman recognizes another across a crowded room. He's right. And I should have found it years ago. Douglas began to speak again. Celeste raised one hand. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was the gesture of a woman who had decided something and no longer needed input. Keep the pad, she said to Jonah. Voice it around her. I want it to sound the way she heard it. Jonah nodded. He asked for a tuning lever, a set of mutes, and 20 minutes. Harlan brought the tools. Rosie sat cross-legged on the stage floor, beside the piano bench, her tuning fork resting in her lap, watching her father work the way she had watched him work since before she could remember. He did not rush. He moved through the bass register one note at a time, adjusting the tension of each string by fractions so small that most ears would not have registered the change. But with each adjustment, the notes around the damping pad began to open. The resonance that had been trapped began to breathe. The bass register, which had sounded flat and lifeless for 11 years, began to fill the hall with a warmth that several people in the audience later described as the sound of someone exhaling after holding their breath for a very long time. Harlan watched from the wings with his arms folded and his jaw set tight. He was not emotional in the way that the audience would soon be. He was emotional in the way that old craftsmen are when they see a piece of work so precise and so quiet that it reminds them why they learned the trade in the first place. 18 minutes after he started, Jonah set down the tuning lever. He played a single chord in the bass. The sound rolled through the hall, deep and full and patient, and carried with it a color that had not been heard inside the Mercer in over a decade. Lillian Tate, in the second row, put her hand over her mouth. Celeste, standing in the wings, pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes. She had not heard that sound since she was 24 years old, sitting in the back row of this same hall, listening to her mother play Schubert on a Tuesday afternoon when no one else was in the building. She had thought she would never hear it again. She had been wrong. It's ready, Jonah said. He stood, wiped his hands on the cloth he kept in his back pocket, and stepped away from the piano. He did not bow. He did not look at the audience. He walked to where Rosie was sitting, knelt beside her, and said quietly, "Did you hear that?" Rosie nodded. Her eyes were bright. "It sounded like Mommy's fork," she whispered. Jonah's hand found the top of her head. He held it there for a moment. Then he stood and turned toward the wings. Celeste blocked his path, not physically but by standing in it. Barefoot on the stage floor, her composure stripped away so completely that the woman who remained looked nothing like the executive who had dismissed him an hour ago. "We don't have a soloist," she said. "That's not my problem to solve. You just tuned a piano by ear in 18 minutes that 3 Juilliard-trained technicians couldn't fix in 5 months. Can you play? I'm a tuner, not a performer. Can you play?" Jonah was quiet. Claire had asked him that once, years ago, on a night when he had finished restoring an old Baldwin Grand for a church in Belvedere. He had run his hands across the keys to test the action, and without thinking had played the opening of Debussy's Clair de Lune. Claire had been standing in the doorway. She had not said anything for a long time. Then she had said, very softly, "You should play that for people, Jonah, not just for pianos." He had never played for an audience. He had never wanted to. Playing was something that happened between him and the instrument, a private conversation that did not require witnesses. But Rosie was looking at him. She was looking at him with the tuning fork pressed against her collarbone, and her face held the same expression it had held on the night he told her that her mother was not coming home. Not grief, not fear. Expectation. the absolute terrifying expectation of a child who believes her father is capable of more than he has ever allowed himself to be. "One piece," he said. "Then we go home." He sat at the bench. The leather was cracked and cool. The keys, under the stage light, had the faint yellow of old ivory, and they carried a smoothness that came not from polish, but from years of being touched by hands that loved them. He adjusted the bench. He placed his feet on the pedals. He rested his hands in his lap for a moment and breathed. 300 people fell silent. Douglas Fenn uncrossed his legs. Lillian Tate leaned forward. Harlan Cage gripped the edge of the curtain in the wings and did not blink. Rosie sat on the stage floor, 3 feet from the pedals, her tuning fork clutched in both hands, her face lifted toward her father with the kind of belief that has no conditions and no reservations and no exit strategy. Jonah played. He chose Claire de Lune, not because it was impressive, but because it was the piece Claire had heard him play on the night she told him he should share it. The first notes entered the hall the way moonlight enters a room. Not all at once, but in slow, spreading silver. The Steinway, freed from the mismatch that had strangled it for a decade, responded with a voice so full and so clear that several people in the audience looked at one another as though checking whether they were hearing the same thing. He did not play like a concert pianist. He played like a man who understood the inside of the instrument the way a surgeon understands the inside of a body. Every note was placed with the knowledge of what the strings would do with it, how the soundboard would carry it, where the room would catch it, and where it would let it go. It was not a performance. It was a conversation between a man and a piano, held in public for the first time, and the audience was not watching a show. They were overhearing something intimate. In the third row, Douglas Fenn sat very still, the political calculation he had been running all evening, the quiet satisfaction of watching Celeste fail, the speeches he had prepared for the emergency board meeting he intended to call on Monday. All of it went suddenly and completely silent inside his head. He was not a sentimental man, but he had loved Renata Moreau in the distant, complicated way that old board members sometimes love the founders they outlive, and the sound coming from the stage was the sound of her piano remembering what it was built to do. Lillian Tate wept without making a sound. In the wings, Harlan Cage finally blinked. His eyes were wet. He did not wipe them. Celeste stood at the edge of the stage with her shoes in one hand and her other hand pressed flat against the wall. The vibration of the piano traveled through the plaster and into her palm, and for a moment she was not the executive director of the Mercer Concert Hall. She was a girl sitting in the back row of an empty theater, listening to her mother play, not knowing that it was one of the last times she ever would. The piece lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds. When the final chord faded, the silence that followed was not the silence of an audience deciding whether to clap. It was the silence of 300 people who had been reminded, without warning, of someone they had loved and lost and not thought about in a long time. Then Rosie stood up. She crossed the 3 feet between her spot on the floor and her father's bench, climbed onto his lap, and put her arms around his neck. The tuning fork, still in her hand, pressed cold against the back of his shirt. "Mommy would have liked that," she said. Jonah's arms closed around her. He pressed his face into her hair and breathed. He did not look at the audience. He did not look at Celeste. He did not look at the 300 people who were now rising to their feet. He held his daughter in a circle of stage light on a piano bench that smelled of old wood and lemon oil, and he let himself, for the first time in 3 years, feel something that was not loss. The applause began the way weather begins. A single pair of hands in the back row, then another, then a wave that swept forward until it broke against the stage. Lillian Tate stood with her program pressed against her chest. Douglas Fenn stood because the woman beside him stood and because, he discovered with some surprise, his own hands were already moving. Celeste did not clap. She stood in the wings with her palms still flat against the wall, and the vibration still traveling through her fingers. and she understood something she had not understood before. She had spent 14 months trying to protect her mother's legacy by running it like a corporation. She had hired specialists and consultants and advisors. She had never once hired someone who simply knew how to listen. Jonah carried Rosie off the stage through the wings. He did not stop for the ovation. He did not wait for Celeste. He walked back to the loading corridor and set Rosie on a folding chair and began buttoning her jacket, because it was 9:15 on a Thursday night and she had school in the morning, and that was, in the end, the most important thing. Celeste found him there. She had taken the long way around, through the house and backstage, to avoid the donors who were already lining up to ask her questions she did not yet know how to answer. She stood in the corridor holding her shoes and looking at a man buttoning his daughter's coat, and she felt the full weight of what she had said to him in this same corridor an hour ago. "I was wrong," she said. Jonah finished the last button before he looked up. "I stood here and told you to carry chairs. I looked at your shirt and decided you had nothing to offer. I am sorry." She did not explain. She did not invoke the pressure of the donors or the absence of the soloist or the fear of losing the hall. She let the apology stand on its own, unsupported and undecorated, the way honest sentences stand. Jonah rose. "You're not the first person to hear what I do and assume it isn't much." The sentence was not a weapon. It was a fact. And it told Celeste that her behavior had not been unusual. It had been ordinary. It had been one more moment in a long line of moments in which a man who worked with his hands was made to feel that his hands were not enough. That ordinariness was worse than cruelty, because cruelty at least admits that it sees you. "Then let me be the first to do something about it," Celeste said. She offered him a position, head of restoration and voicing for the Mercer's instrument collection, including the Steinway, with full authority over the care of every piano in the building and a salary that would let him stop driving from church to church in a truck with a dead battery. Jonah looked at Rosie. Rosie looked at Celeste with the careful, measuring gaze of a child who has already decided that trust is not given but proven. "I don't take work that makes me miss her bedtime," Jonah said. "Or her school concerts. Or her Thursday spelling tests." Celeste crouched until she was level with Rosie. She did not speak over the girl's head. She spoke to her directly, the way Renata had always spoken to children, as though they were the only people in the room whose opinion actually mattered. "If your dad works here, the schedule fits around you, not the other way around." Rosie studied her for a long time. Then, with the surgical honesty of a 7-year-old who has heard everything and forgotten nothing, she said, "You told my daddy to carry chairs." The corridor went very still. Jonah's mouth pressed into a line that was not quite a smile. Celeste did not flinch. "I did, and I was wrong. And if you let me, I'd like to spend a long time making up for it." Rosie considered this. She looked at her tuning fork. She looked at her father. She looked at Celeste's bare feet on the concrete floor. "You're not wearing shoes," she said. "No. My mommy used to take her shoes off when she was done being serious." Celeste's composure cracked along a seam she had not known was there. She blinked twice, quickly, and a faint color rose along her neck that no amount of professional training could have prevented. Jonah looked at Celeste. For the first time that evening, something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, exactly. Not yet, but the absence of a wall that had been there before. "Coffee," he said. "No donors, no board members. And nobody tells my daughter where she doesn't belong." "Agreed," Celeste said. The three of them walked down the loading corridor toward the parking lot. Behind them, deep inside the hall, the Steinway sat under its single light with the lid still raised, the strings still humming faintly with the memory of what had just passed through them. To Celeste, it was the sound of her mother's piano finding its voice again. To Jonah, it was proof. If his daughter ever needed proof that her belief in him had never been misplaced, to Rosie, who walked between them holding her tuning fork in one hand and her father's calloused hand in the other. It was the sound of the night her daddy made a whole room full of people stand up and listen. Between Jonah and Celeste, it was not yet love. It was something better suited to a first step. It was respect, quietly and honestly earned, and it would in time become the foundation of everything that came after.